I tell my patients to eat butter. It's not a heart attack in a wrapper. It's actually a way to learn what satiety feels like. Many people struggle to recognize when they feel full, leading to overeating and weight gain.
No. On one thing she's right, and on one thing I think she might be wrong, at least according to the totality of evidence we have today. The amounts of foods that you can eat throughout the day that will put you at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease or at a lower risk of cardiovascular disease is different for different food items. One of the most studied fats we have as of today is saturated fats. And what many people don't seem to know is that saturated fats come in different forms. As discussed in one of my latest videos, saturated fats from chocolate, so from raw cacao powder or raw cacao beans, seems to be neutral or even protective for cardiovascular disease. So what about the saturated fats being present in butter? What's important to consider when analyzing studies about saturated fats is 3 key points. Number one is something that we already looked at, and that's the different types of saturated fats. When you want to look whether butter is associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease mortality, you have to single those fats out and not lump in together all the saturated fats from different food sources, such as chocolate, low-fat milk, yogurt or other fermented dairy products, butter, and, well, you guess where I'm going with this. Number two, replacement. Whether you want to see if something increases or decreases the risk of, for example, cardiovascular disease, you have to see with what it's being replaced with. If you replace butter with refined carbs, I don't expect to see much of a change. But if you replace butter with polyunsaturated fats, for example from nuts, then we should see a decreased risk. Number three, the dose. And this is where I would like to start looking at the research. This is something that a lot of studies seem to be not doing right. There's simply not enough of a gap between the lowest saturated fat intake and the highest saturated fat intake. What do I mean with that? Let's have a look at a study published by Huber and colleagues in 2020. They included randomized trials with a variety of grade selection criteria that I will not read out at full length to respect the length of this video. But one of the most important key factors here is that the duration of these randomized trials was more than 2 years. And I would like to shift our focus to this graph that you see right here on the screen. Down at the bottom, you see the percentage of saturated fats compared to your total caloric intake. We can see that up until 8% of your total caloric intake, the risk neither goes up or down. But look at the jump that happens from 8 to 10%. Depending on the outcome, it quadruples the risk. And from 10 to 13% and moving forward, it doesn't seem to actually get higher. What this graph is showing us is that if you take a study and you compare participants that eat around 11% of calories coming from saturated fats with people that consume 20% of calories coming from saturated fats, we should not see any significant differences between these two groups because the saturated fats in both groups were not low enough. Let's focus on cardiovascular disease here, and let's have a look at the study published in 2016 by Pimpin and colleagues. This study that you see right here on the screen found no association between butter intake and cardiovascular disease. There's actually just 4 studies included that looked at cardiovascular disease, which is already a little bit strange because we have so many studies looking at saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease. But anyways, let's have a look at the studies that these researchers included. The first one is a study by Avalos and colleagues. And I would like to shift our attention on the far right, because this is what the researchers adjusted for in this cohort. The researchers adjusted for age, BMI, diabetes, hypertension, and LDL cholesterol. No surprise that the results were neutral. Adjusting means that you're seeing something as a confounder. A very simple explanation on what a confounder is looking at smoking and coffee consumption. Coffee consumption is associated with an increased risk for lung cancer. But once you actually adjust for smoking, the risk disappears. Why? Because a lot of people that smoke also drink coffee. Smoking in this case is a confounder. If saturated fats increase cholesterol, more specifically LDL cholesterol, why would you adjust for LDL cholesterol? That doesn't make any sense. Moving on. The next study that was included in this meta-analysis was released by Erickson and colleagues. And I highlighted the main issues of this cohort here in yellow. As you can see here, the saturated fat intake, the lowest one, is 12%. As already discussed, 12% is not low enough. You have to go at least under 10% to see a decreased risk in cardiovascular disease. Moving on. The next study that the researchers included was conducted by Goldbaum and colleagues. In this cohort, people were consuming a low amount of butter. You can see that both men and women alike ate 8 to 9 grams of butter per day. But regardless of the low butter consumption, the researchers saw an increased risk for all-cause and ischemic heart disease mortality for both butter and dairy fat intake, and that's just per 10 grams per day of around 4%, but only in women and not in men. What was also really interesting here, the lowest quintile of people eating dairy products were eating around 72 grams of milk products per day. But as highlighted here in yellow, all the dairy products consumed in this cohort were zero, apart from cheese, in which the participants were eating a merely 1 gram per day. What was also not pointed out in this study is the total amount of saturated fats that the participants were consuming. It would have been interesting to see whether the intake was lower than 10% or higher than 10% in the lowest saturated fat group. Let's have a look at the last study. This study was released by Larson and colleagues in 2009. And as you can see here, they adjusted for serum total cholesterol levels. This completely eliminates the effect saturated might have on your cholesterol levels. Why just include these 4 studies when we can look at the totality of evidence? And yes, I get it, the meta-analysis that we just looked at was published in 2016, but I just want to quickly show you all the studies that I could find in the span of like half an hour that showed that high saturated fat intakes, so above 10% of your total calories, are associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. This systematic review and meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies included a lot of well-designed and well-adjusted prospective cohort studies. And when I say a lot, well, I mean a lot. The graph you see here is for saturated fat consumption. We can see an increased risk for all-cause cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality. What's also interesting here is that we see a flattening of the increased risk of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality at the around 10% mark. 10% of course referring to total caloric intake. That doesn't seem to be the case for cancer mortality, in which higher intake of saturated fats increases the risk even further. By the way, the researchers found a decreased risk for monounsaturated fats, which are illustrated at the top, and a decreased risk for polyunsaturated fats, which are illustrated at the bottom, for all-cause cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality. And we have more studies to look at. This systematic review and meta-analysis of prospective studies came to the conclusion that just replacing 5 grams of butter per day will lead to a 6% reduction in cardiometabolic disease. Similar results can be seen in this study, in this one as well, and also in this study. All these studies used, in my opinion, great selection criteria, and I stumbled upon this study by around a half an hour search. So there's way more research out there. Bottom line is that you, doctor, are a figure of authority. And as such, you hold a tremendous amount of responsibility in your hands. When you talk, your patients and your followers will listen. I highly encourage you to look at the totality of evidence before giving out any nutritional advice. What are your thoughts about this topic? Feel free to let me know in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you during my next video.